A lonely rancher bought a black girl sold by her stepmother, then realized the trembling figure stepping off the dusty platform possessed secrets that would shatter everything he thought he knew. The townspeople see only a commodity, whispering crude calculations about her worth while assuming she'll vanish into silent servitude behind closed doors. But the weathered cowboy watching from the shadows carries his own burden, a dying promise that drives him to intervene. What neither the girl nor the rancher understands is that her stepmother's desperate transaction has set in motion a conspiracy that threatens to destroy them both, while the girl's hidden past holds the key to exposing corruption that runs deeper than anyone imagines. Will two unlikely souls find redemption together, or will the truth they uncover cost them everything? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The courthouse steps blazed under the Arizona sun as Constance Hartwell adjusted her black mourning dress. She clutched legal papers with trembling fingers, while her stepdaughter stood silent beside her. The woman's voice cracked as she addressed the gathered crowd. "Times have been hard since my husband passed. I cannot afford to keep her." Abigail Thornfield maintained perfect posture despite the humiliation burning in her chest. Men circled like vultures, evaluating her worth with calculating eyes. Their whispers carried on the desert wind. Strong-looking girl. Could work the fields. Might be useful in other ways. Judge Morrison emerged from the courthouse, his gold pocket watch catching the light. He surveyed the scene with practiced indifference. This transaction would be swift and legal. The paperwork had been prepared. "Gentlemen, please state your offers clearly." Arthur Calloway watched from across the dusty street. His weathered hands gripped his horse's reins as memories flooded back. His dying wife, Sarah, had made him promise something 3 years ago. "Help someone the way I couldn't be helped." The words echoed in his mind as the bidding began. $50, called out a merchant. 75, countered a rancher. Arthur's jaw tightened. These men saw only profit. They would work her to death in their fields or worse. His conscience wrestled with his desire to remain invisible. 100, he heard himself say. The crowd turned. Arthur Calloway rarely spoke in public gatherings. His ranch lay 5 miles outside town, and he kept to himself since Sarah's death. A burly mine foreman raised his hand. 125. Arthur's heart pounded. His savings were modest. Every dollar mattered for his struggling cattle operation. But Sarah's final words burned in his memory. $200. Silence fell over the courthouse steps. The amount exceeded what most men earned in 6 months. Constance's eyes widened with greedy satisfaction. Judge Morrison nodded his approval. Sold to Mr. Calloway. Arthur approached with heavy steps. He counted out bills from his leather wallet while Constance signed the transfer papers. Abigail's face revealed nothing, but her hands remained steady. She had endured worse humiliations. The crowd dispersed as legal formalities concluded. Arthur found himself standing before a young woman whose intelligent eyes seemed to see straight through him. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, yet carried herself with quiet dignity. "Gather your belongings," he said quietly. "I have none." The words struck him like a physical blow. Constance had stripped her of everything. Arthur led the way to his wagon without speaking. Abigail followed, her head held high despite the stares from townspeople. The ride to Arthur's ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Rolling hills stretched endlessly under the blazing sun. Abigail studied the landscape with sharp attention, noting water sources and grazing patterns. Her observations went unnoticed by Arthur, who wrestled with his own thoughts. What had he done? $200 represented his entire emergency fund. Winter was coming, and his cattle herd remained small. Yet something about this situation felt desperately wrong. No human being should be sold like livestock. "Your stepmother seemed eager to be rid of you," Arthur finally said. "Constance married my father for his property. With me gone, she claims everything." Her educated speech surprised him. Most people in this territory spoke in rough frontier dialect. Abigail's words carried careful pronunciation and proper grammar, strange for someone supposedly raised in poverty. Arthur's ranch appeared modest but well-maintained. A two-story house sat surrounded by sturdy outbuildings. Cattle grazed in distant pastures while chickens pecked near the barn. His ranch hands looked up curiously as the wagon approached. "This will be your home now," Arthur said. Abigail surveyed her new surroundings. The house showed signs of a woman's touch that had faded over time. Flower boxes sat empty, curtains hung crooked in windows. This man lived alone with his grief. "What do you expect from me?" she asked. Arthur dismounted slowly. He had not thought this through properly. The transaction had been driven by impulse and conscience rather than planning. "Help with cooking and cleaning, I suppose. The ranch hands handle livestock. I can do more than domestic work." Something in her tone made Arthur look closer. Confidence radiated from this young woman despite her circumstances. She examined his property with the eye of someone who understood land management. How was this possible? "We'll see," he said cautiously. That evening, Arthur's ranch hands gathered for dinner. Cookie served beans and cornbread while men discussed the day's work. Abigail sat apart, observing conversations about cattle prices and weather patterns. Her presence made everyone uncomfortable. "Boss, what exactly are your plans here?" asked Jake, the lead hand. Arthur pushed food around his plate. He had no clear answer. Purchasing Abigail had been an act of conscience, not business strategy. "She'll help around the house." Seems like expensive help. The men exchanged meaningful glances. Their boss had acted strangely since his wife's death, but this decision puzzled everyone. $200 could have bought prize breeding stock or equipment upgrades. After dinner, Arthur showed Abigail to a small room that had once served as Sarah's sewing space. Clean sheets covered a narrow bed. A wash basin sat on a simple table. "This will be yours." Abigail nodded her thanks. Privacy represented luxury after months of uncertainty with Constance. She had learned to expect nothing and appreciate small mercies. "Mr. Calloway?" Arthur paused at the doorway. "Why did you help me?" He stared at the floor. The honest answer would reveal too much about his private pain and guilt over Sarah's death. Seemed like the right thing to do. Arthur woke before dawn to find Abigail already in the kitchen. Coffee brewed on the stove while bacon sizzled in the cast-iron pan. She moved with quiet efficiency, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands without being asked. "You didn't need to start so early." "I prefer to stay busy." Her response carried an edge of independence that surprised him. Most people in her situation would show more deference. Abigail seemed determined to prove her worth through action rather than gratitude. The ranch hands filed in for breakfast, nodding awkwardly at Abigail before taking their seats. She served plates without meeting their eyes, maintaining the careful distance of someone who understood social boundaries. After the men departed for their duties, Arthur lingered over his coffee. Abigail cleared dishes with practiced movements, her attention drawn to a shelf of books near the window. Medical texts sat alongside farming manuals and legal documents from land transactions. "Those belonged to my late wife. She studied medicine before we married." Abigail's eyes lingered on the leather-bound volumes. Her fingers traced the spine of the anatomy textbook with obvious familiarity. The gesture lasted only seconds, but Arthur noticed. "Can you read?" "Some." Her answer came too quickly. Arthur sensed evasion but chose not to press. Everyone carried secrets in this territory. Privacy deserved respect. Later that morning, Arthur discovered one of his calves lying motionless in the pasture. The young animal's breathing came in shallow gasps while its mother stood nearby, lowing anxiously. Jake examined the sick calf with growing concern. "Looks bad, boss. Might be milk fever or something worse." Arthur knelt beside the animal, feeling helpless. Veterinary knowledge remained scarce in this remote area. The nearest doctor lived 2 days' ride away in Tucson. By then, the calf would likely be dead. "We should put it out of its misery," Jake suggested grimly. Abigail appeared at the fence line, watching the scene unfold. Her eyes assessed the calf's condition with clinical precision. She observed the animal's posture, breathing pattern, and the discharge around its eyes. "Wait!" she called out. Both men turned in surprise. Abigail climbed through the fence rails and approached the sick animal. She knelt beside the calf, examining its symptoms with careful attention. "The breathing suggests pneumonia, but see how it favors the left side? This looks like pleurisy." Arthur stared at her in shock. "How do you know that?" Abigail's composure faltered. She had revealed too much. Her knowledge of veterinary medicine would raise questions she could not safely answer. "My father taught me about animals." "What kind of man was your father?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Abigail weighed her options carefully. Lies would eventually unravel, but truth carried its own dangers. "He was educated, a freed man who believed knowledge meant freedom." Arthur's mind raced. Educated freed men were rare in any territory, but especially here. Such a man would have accumulated property and status. Why would his daughter end up sold by a stepmother? What happened to him? He died of fever 2 years ago. Constance married him 6 months before his death. The timeline suddenly made sense. Constance had targeted a wealthy widower, married him quickly, then eliminated the competition for his inheritance. Selling Abigail removed the rightful heir while providing immediate cash. "She stole your inheritance. She stole everything." Abigail's voice carried bitter resignation. She turned back to the sick calf, grateful for the distraction from painful memories. Her hands moved with practiced skill as she examined the animal more thoroughly. "We need to create a steam tent. The inflammation needs moisture to break up congestion." Jake looked skeptical. "Steam tent for a calf? Heat water in large pots. We'll create a canopy with blankets to trap the vapor." Arthur found himself following her instructions without question. Something in her manner commanded respect. This was not guesswork or folk wisdom. Abigail demonstrated genuine medical knowledge. They worked together for the next hour, creating a makeshift treatment area. Abigail guided the process while Arthur and Jake provided muscle. The calf's breathing gradually improved as warm, moist air cleared its congested lungs. "Where did you really learn this?" Arthur asked quietly. Abigail hesitated before answering. Trust had to start somewhere, and this man had already saved her from a worse fate. "My father studied at a college back east before the war. He taught me everything he knew about medicine, law, mathematics, and literature." Arthur's worldview shifted dramatically. The woman he had purchased as domestic help possessed education surpassing most professionals in the territory. Her knowledge could benefit the entire community if properly utilized. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me?" Her point was valid. Claims of advanced education from someone in her position would seem like fantasy or deception. Only practical demonstration could prove such abilities. The calf struggled to its feet as afternoon approached. Its breathing had normalized and strength was returning. Abigail's treatment had worked. Jake stared in amazement at the recovery. "That's the finest doctoring I've ever seen." Word of the miraculous cure spread quickly among the ranch hands. By evening, men approached Abigail with their own ailments. A cut that wouldn't heal properly. Persistent cough that lingered from winter. Stomach troubles that plagued Cookie for weeks. Arthur watched as Abigail carefully examined each case. She offered treatments based on genuine medical knowledge rather than superstition. Her advice proved sound and effective. That night, Arthur sat alone in his study, pondering the implications. He had purchased what he thought was an unfortunate young woman. Instead, he had acquired a trained physician who could serve the entire community. The realization brought both excitement and fear. Abigail's abilities would attract attention from town authorities. Judge Morrison and others would not appreciate an educated woman disrupting established social orders. Arthur understood that protecting Abigail meant protecting something much larger than one person's freedom. Word of the calf's recovery spread beyond Arthur's ranch like wildfire across dry grass. By the 3rd day, families began appearing at the property line with sick children and ailing livestock. Abigail found herself treating everything from infected wounds to digestive ailments. She established a makeshift clinic in Arthur's barn, using clean straw and borrowed lanterns for proper lighting. Her patients included ranch hands' wives, local farmers, and even the blacksmith's daughter who suffered from persistent fevers. "My father always said knowledge unused was knowledge wasted," Abigail explained to Arthur as she prepared herbal remedies. Arthur watched her work with growing admiration. Each diagnosis demonstrated careful observation and logical reasoning. Abigail asked detailed questions about symptoms, examined patients thoroughly, and prescribed treatments based on solid medical principles. The transformation in community attitude was remarkable. People who had witnessed her humiliation on the courthouse steps now sought her counsel with genuine respect. Children who had stared at her with curious hostility now brought her wildflowers and small gifts. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her youngest son, who had developed a troublesome cough that kept the family awake at night. Abigail listened to the boy's chest using a makeshift stethoscope fashioned from a wooden tube. "The congestion is breaking up nicely. Continue the steam treatments twice daily." "Thank you, Miss Abigail. Billy's been sleeping through the night for the first time in weeks." Such exchanges became routine as Abigail's reputation grew. She treated each patient with patience and dignity, regardless of their social standing or ability to pay. Her father had taught her that healing was a sacred duty, not a business transaction. Word eventually reached Dusthaven's established authorities. Judge Morrison received reports about the unusual medical practice operating without proper licensing. The situation troubled him for reasons beyond bureaucratic concerns. Constance Hartwell burst into the judge's office without ceremony, her face flushed with indignation. "She's making us look like fools. People are questioning why I sold such a valuable person." "Calm yourself, Mrs. Hartwell. We'll handle this situation appropriately." Morrison understood the broader implications. An educated woman providing medical services challenged established power structures. If people began viewing Abigail as a respected professional rather than purchased property, uncomfortable questions would arise about the entire transaction. "Arthur Calloway needs to control his property," Constance demanded. "I'll speak with him personally." Meanwhile, Arthur discovered Abigail teaching reading lessons to a group of children behind the barn. She used a piece of charcoal to write letters on a smooth wooden board while young voices repeated the alphabet. The scene struck him as both beautiful and dangerous. "Their parents asked me to help," Abigail explained when Arthur approached. "Most children here have no access to formal education." Arthur recognized the truth in her words. The nearest school operated in Tucson, too far for daily attendance. Frontier children grew up illiterate, limiting their future opportunities. "What else did your father teach you?" "Mathematics, literature, history, basic law." He believed education was the foundation of true freedom. Her father's philosophy impressed Arthur, but it also worried him. Educated individuals posed threats to those who profited from ignorance and exploitation. Judge Morrison and his associates would not tolerate such disruption quietly. That evening, Jake brought news from town. Judge Morrison had been asking questions about the medical treatments occurring at Arthur's ranch. He expressed concern about unlicensed practice and potential legal violations. "Boss, you might want to be careful. The judge seemed mighty interested in your business." Arthur understood the warning. Morrison wielded considerable power in territorial affairs. His disapproval could bring serious consequences for anyone who crossed him. The next morning, a formal delegation arrived at Arthur's ranch. Judge Morrison rode alongside Sheriff Davis and 2 other town officials. Their stern expressions indicated this was not a social visit. "Mr. Calloway, we need to discuss some irregularities regarding your recent acquisition." Arthur met them on his front porch, his jaw set with quiet determination. Abigail watched from the kitchen window, recognizing the hostile intent in their posture. "What irregularities?" "Reports suggest you're allowing unlicensed medical practice on your property. This creates liability issues for the community." Morrison's words carried veiled threats. Arthur understood that challenging established authority would bring retaliation, but his conscience would not allow retreat. People are getting well. That seems like community benefit, not liability. The law requires proper certification for medical practice. Your property could face seizure if violations continue. The threat was clear. Morrison possessed legal authority to destroy Arthur's livelihood if he persisted in protecting Abigail's activities. Yet Arthur remembered Sarah's dying words about standing up for justice when it mattered most. "I'll take that risk." Morrison's eyes narrowed with cold anger. Few people challenged his authority so directly. Arthur Calloway was making a dangerous mistake that would require correction. "Consider your position carefully, Mr. Calloway. Some decisions have permanent consequences." After the delegation departed, Arthur found Abigail in the barn, preparing to treat a farmer's infected hand wound. Her movements carried the same steady competence, but tension showed in her shoulders. "You heard?" "I heard." Arthur's voice was firm with resolve. "We'll continue as before." Abigail looked up from her medical supplies, studying Arthur's face carefully. This man was risking everything to protect her right to help others. Such courage deserved honest reciprocation. "There's something else you should know about my father's background." Arthur waited as Abigail gathered her thoughts. Whatever she was about to reveal would change their situation significantly. He owned considerable property before his death: land, investments, even partial ownership in a silver mine. Constance didn't just steal a modest inheritance. The implications hit Arthur like a physical blow. Abigail was not just an educated woman sold into servitude. She was the rightful heir to substantial wealth, defrauded by a conspiracy that likely involved Morrison himself. Ezra Blackwood appeared at Arthur's ranch 3 days after the judge's visit. The town historian carried a weathered leather satchel and wore the expression of a man bearing troublesome news. His timing seemed more than coincidental. "Mr. Calloway, I need to speak privately with you and Miss Abigail." Arthur led them to his study, closing the door against curious ears. Ezra's nervous energy filled the small room as he unpacked documents from his satchel. "I've been researching property transfers in our county records. The patterns are disturbing." Ezra spread papers across Arthur's desk, revealing a complex web of transactions spanning several years. Each document bore Judge Morrison's official seal and signature. Notice the similarities. Wealthy landowners die unexpectedly. Their properties transfer to new spouses or business partners, always with Morrison's legal approval. Abigail studied the documents with growing recognition. Her father's case fit the pattern perfectly: a quick marriage, sudden death, and immediate property transfer to the surviving spouse. "How many cases?" "At least 12 that I can document, probably more." Arthur felt sick as the implications became clear. Morrison had been orchestrating systematic theft for years, using his judicial authority to legitimize fraud. Constance was merely one participant in a much larger conspiracy. "There's something else," Ezra continued quietly. "Yesterday, Morrison visited the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson." The news sent chills down Arthur's spine. Federal marshals possessed authority that superseded local officials. If Morrison was seeking their intervention, the situation had escalated beyond simple intimidation. What grounds would he have for involving federal authorities? Ezra's expression darkened further. "Runaway slave laws. Morrison claims Miss Abigail's documentation is fraudulent." Abigail's face went pale. Slave laws remained federally enforced even in territories where slavery was uncommon. A false accusation could result in her immediate arrest and transport to southern states, where her fate would be sealed. "My father's papers prove my free birth. Morrison will claim those documents are forgeries. His word carries significant weight with territorial authorities." Arthur paced the small study, his mind racing through options. Direct confrontation with Morrison would fail against superior legal authority. Flight would brand them as fugitives and confirm guilt in official minds. Yet staying put invited certain disaster. "How long do we have?" "Federal marshals should arrive within the week, maybe less." The timeline compressed their options dramatically. Arthur realized that his promise to Sarah had evolved into something much larger than protecting one person. They were now fighting institutional corruption that threatened the entire community. That evening, Arthur found himself examining his late wife's effects in their bedroom. Sarah had been passionate about justice and equality, often expressing frustration with territorial politics. Her medical journals contained detailed observations about community health and social conditions. She would have supported what we're doing, Arthur murmured to himself. Among Sarah's papers, he discovered correspondence with abolitionists and reformers back east. His wife had maintained connections with people who fought against systematic oppression. Her network might provide resources for their current struggle. Meanwhile, Abigail spent sleepless hours studying Morrison's court records by lamplight. Her legal training revealed patterns that would be invisible to untrained observers. The judge's rulings consistently favored certain individuals while discriminating against others. She documented inconsistencies in his application of territorial law, noting how interpretations shifted based on the financial interests of preferred associates. Morrison's corruption extended beyond property theft into systematic abuse of judicial authority. "Arthur, look at this," Abigail called softly. He joined her at the kitchen table, where documents lay scattered like fallen leaves. Abigail pointed to a series of mining claims that Morrison had validated despite obvious irregularities. These claims overlap existing properties. The original owners were forced to sell at reduced prices after Morrison ruled against them in boundary disputes. Arthur studied the pattern she had identified. Morrison was not just stealing individual properties, but orchestrating the systematic transfer of valuable land to his associates. The silver mine, partially owned by Abigail's father, was likely part of this larger scheme. "He's been planning this for years, and we have the evidence to prove it." The realization brought both hope and terror. They possessed documentation that could destroy Morrison's career and expose his criminal network. However, using that evidence would require surviving long enough to present it to honest authorities. The next morning brought disturbing news from town. Sheriff Davis had posted notices requiring all residents to report any suspicious activities involving unlicensed professionals or questionable documentation. The language clearly targeted Abigail while maintaining legal ambiguity. Jake returned from Dusthaven with additional intelligence gathered from saloon conversations. Federal marshals were indeed traveling toward their territory. Morrison had convinced them that dangerous fugitives were operating in the area. "Boss, maybe it's time to consider other options. Mexico ain't too far south." Arthur appreciated his foreman's loyalty, but flight would abandon the community to Morrison's continued exploitation. Other families would suffer the same injustices that had destroyed Abigail's inheritance. "We're not running." That afternoon, Ezra arrived with the final piece of their puzzle. Hidden among his historical records was the original deed to Abigail's father's property, filed before Morrison's judicial appointment. The document proved ownership and contradicted all subsequent transfers. This was buried in old territorial records. Morrison probably forgot it existed. Abigail examined her father's signature on the aged paper, remembering his steady hand and careful penmanship. He had trusted legal systems to protect his family's future, never imagining the depth of corruption that would destroy his plans. "We have enough evidence to expose everything. The question is whether we'll live long enough to use it." Arthur's blunt assessment captured their desperate situation perfectly. They possessed the tools for justice but faced enemies who controlled the immediate legal system. The approaching marshals represented either salvation or destruction, depending on Morrison's influence over their judgment. The final confrontation was inevitable now. Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived in Dusthaven on a dust-covered bay horse, his silver badge catching the morning sunlight. Judge Morrison greeted him personally at the courthouse steps, eager to present his version of events before anyone else could speak. "Marshal Hayes, thank you for responding so quickly. This situation requires federal intervention." Hayes dismounted slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing about his thoughts. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him to gather facts before forming opinions. Morrison's urgent telegrams had raised questions about the judge's motives. "Show me the documentation supporting your claims." Morrison produced carefully prepared papers alleging that Abigail was a runaway slave whose freedom documents were fraudulent. The case seemed straightforward on paper, but Hayes noticed subtle inconsistencies in the legal language. Meanwhile, Word of the marshal's arrival spread through the community like wildfire. Families who had benefited from Abigail's medical care gathered nervously in small groups, discussing what they could do to help her. Mrs. Henderson clutched her son's hand as she spoke with other mothers outside the general store. That girl saved Billy's life when the fever wouldn't break. We can't let them take her. Similar conversations occurred throughout Dusthaven as people realized they might lose someone who had genuinely improved their lives. The brewing conflict would force everyone to choose sides between established authority and obvious justice. Arthur spent the morning preparing for what might be his final stand. He cleaned his rifle not for violence, but as a symbol of his determination. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Abigail organized their evidence with methodical precision. Each document was labeled and arranged to tell a coherent story of corruption and theft. Her legal training proved invaluable as she prepared arguments that could withstand official scrutiny. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," Arthur said quietly. "My father always said truth has its own power. We'll see if he was right." Judge Morrison led Marshal Hayes toward Arthur's ranch that afternoon. Accompanied by Sheriff Davis and several armed deputies, their procession resembled a military expedition rather than a legal inquiry. Arthur watched them approach from his front porch, Abigail standing beside him with quiet dignity. The entire ranch fell silent as horses kicked up dust clouds in the afternoon heat. "Marshal Hayes, I assume," Arthur called out. The federal officer dismounted and approached with careful steps. Something about this situation felt different from Morrison's description. The accused parties showed no signs of guilt or fear. "Mr. Calloway, I'm here to investigate claims regarding your recent acquisition. This is a serious federal matter. Then let's handle it seriously." Arthur's calm response surprised Hayes, who had expected either defiance or desperate pleading. Instead, he faced someone prepared for honest legal proceedings. Morrison stepped forward impatiently. "Marshal, the evidence clearly shows this woman is a runaway slave. Her documents are obvious forgeries." "I'd like to examine those documents myself." Abigail produced her father's papers with steady hands. Hayes studied them carefully, noting the quality of paper, ink consistency, and official seals. His experience with fraudulent documents made him skeptical of Morrison's claims. "These appear authentic to me. What specific evidence suggests forgery?" Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. He had expected the marshal to accept his word without detailed investigation. Federal officers were supposed to cooperate with local authorities, not question their judgment. The circumstances are highly suspicious. No legitimate transaction would involve such an educated individual. Hayes looked directly at Abigail for the first time. Her posture and demeanor suggested someone accustomed to respect rather than subservience. Morrison's characterization did not match observable reality. "Miss, do you understand the charges against you?" "I understand that Judge Morrison seeks to complete the theft of my inheritance by eliminating my legal existence." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Hayes had investigated enough corruption cases to recognize the signs. Morrison's angry reaction suggested the charge had struck home. "That's an outrageous lie," Morrison sputtered. "Then you won't object to examining supporting evidence," Abigail replied calmly. She produced Ezra's documentation showing the pattern of suspicious property transfers. Hayes studied each case with growing interest as the scope of apparent corruption became clear. "These are very serious allegations, Miss Thornfield." Abigail presented her legal analysis of Morrison's rulings, highlighting inconsistencies that revealed systematic bias. Her knowledge of territorial law impressed Hayes, who rarely encountered such expertise outside major cities. Morrison realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The marshal was actually listening to the accusations rather than dismissing them automatically. Federal investigation could destroy everything he had built. "Marshal, you're being manipulated by a clever criminal. Don't let her education fool you." Hayes examined the original deed to Abigail's father's property that Ezra had discovered. The document predated Morrison's appointment and contradicted all subsequent transfers. Forgery would be impossible given the age and official seals. Community members began arriving at Arthur's ranch, drawn by news of the confrontation. Mrs. Henderson brought her healthy son as evidence of Abigail's positive impact. Other families shared similar testimonies about medical care and education services. "This woman has helped our entire community," declared the blacksmith. "Anyone trying to take her away is the real criminal here." Hayes found himself facing an unusual situation. The alleged fugitive had strong community support, while the accuser faced mounting evidence of corruption. His investigation was revealing a complex conspiracy rather than simple slave recovery. "Judge Morrison, I'll need to examine all property records related to this case. Federal investigation will require complete documentation." Morrison's face went pale. Full federal scrutiny would expose years of criminal activity and destroy his carefully constructed network. The situation had become a disaster. Abigail stepped forward with quiet authority. "Marshal Hayes, I formally request federal protection while pursuing civil rights violations and property theft charges against Judge Morrison and Constance Hartwell." The tables had completely turned. Marshal Hayes spent 3 days conducting his federal investigation, transforming Dust Haven's courthouse into a center of justice rather than corruption. Judge Morrison found himself answering questions instead of asking them as evidence mounted against his criminal network. Constance Hartwell arrived under federal escort, her earlier confidence replaced by desperate panic. She had fled toward California but was apprehended at a stagecoach station with stolen money and forged documents in her possession. "Mrs. Hartwell, these property deeds bear signatures that don't match your late husband's handwriting," Hayes stated during questioning. Constance's hands trembled as she faced the evidence of her crimes. The marshal's investigation had uncovered bank records, witness testimonies, and documentation that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. "I was following legal advice from Judge Morrison." Her attempt to shift blame only strengthened the case against both conspirators. Hayes had dealt with similar criminal partnerships throughout his career. Greed inevitably destroyed honor among thieves. Meanwhile, Abigail worked alongside Hayes to document the full scope of Morrison's corruption. Her legal knowledge proved invaluable as they traced property transfers, mining claims, and court rulings that had illegally enriched Morrison's associates. "Miss Thornfield, your analysis of these cases shows remarkable skill. Have you considered formal legal practice? My father always said the law should serve justice, not personal profit." The investigation revealed that Morrison had stolen property worth over $50,000 during his tenure as judge. 12 families had lost their rightful inheritances through his fraudulent rulings and forged documents. Arthur watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Sarah would have been proud to see justice prevail over corruption. His decision to protect Abigail had evolved into something that would benefit the entire community. Ezra Blackwood testified about the historical records he had discovered, providing crucial evidence of Morrison's long-term criminal activities. His documentation skills proved that honest record-keeping was essential for preventing future corruption. These hidden documents show the original property boundaries before Morrison's fraudulent modifications, Ezra explained to the packed courtroom. Community members filled every available seat as the investigation concluded. People who had suffered under Morrison's corrupt rulings finally had their voices heard by honest federal authority. Mrs. Bree Henderson testified about Abigail's medical care that had saved her son's life. The blacksmith described educational services that were improving literacy throughout the region. Teacher after teacher spoke of Abigail's positive impact on their families. "This woman represents everything good about frontier communities," declared one rancher. "She helps others without asking for anything in return." Marshal Hayes compiled his final report as autumn approached. Federal charges would be filed against Morrison for judicial corruption, fraud, and conspiracy. Constance faced additional charges for forgery and theft of inheritance. "Miss Thornfield, all property rights will be restored to you immediately. Federal courts will ensure proper compensation for damages suffered." Abigail's inheritance included not only her father's original land, but also accumulated value from mining operations and property appreciation. The stolen wealth would fund community improvements she had dreamed of implementing. Morrison's downfall came swiftly once federal charges were filed. The territorial government removed him from office permanently and initiated criminal proceedings. His network of corrupt associates faced investigation that would reshape regional politics. Sheriff Davis, who had enforced Morrison's illegal orders, found himself replaced by an honest lawman appointed through federal oversight. The change marked a new era of legitimate law enforcement for Dusthaven. Arthur helped Abigail establish the Thornfield School in a large building constructed on her restored property. The school welcomed children of all backgrounds, providing education that had been denied to frontier families for too long. "Knowledge really is the foundation of freedom," Arthur observed, as they watched children practice reading in the new classroom. "My father would be proud to see his dream fulfilled." The school's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Families traveled from distant settlements to enroll their children in classes taught by Abigail and volunteer teachers she had trained. Adult education programs helped parents learn alongside their children. Arthur and Abigail's partnership evolved naturally from shared purpose into deeper affection. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, common values, and the trust forged through adversity. Sarah would have approved of the match. "Will you marry me, Abigail Thornfield?" "I thought you'd never ask." Their wedding took place in the school they had built together, surrounded by community members whose lives they had touched. Marshal Hayes performed the ceremony before returning to territorial headquarters with his successful investigation complete. The Thornfield School became a model for frontier education, attracting visitors from across the territory who wanted to replicate its success. Abigail's teaching methods emphasized practical skills alongside traditional academic subjects. Medical services continued as an essential part of community life. Abigail trained local women in basic health care, creating a network of skilled practitioners who could serve remote areas effectively. Arthur's ranch prospered under their joint management. Abigail's knowledge of animal husbandry and land management complemented his practical experience, creating one of the most successful operations in the region. Years later, former students would return to visit their teacher, bringing stories of successful careers made possible by the education they had received. Some became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business leaders who carried Abigail's values into their own communities. The courthouse steps where Abigail had once faced humiliation now bore a bronze plaque commemorating the federal investigation that cleaned up territorial corruption. Justice had prevailed through courage, intelligence, and community support. Dusthaven transformed from a place where corruption flourished into a model community that attracted honest settlers seeking opportunity. The Thornfield School remained at its heart, educating new generations who understood that knowledge and justice were inseparable. Abigail Thornfield had begun as someone dismissed and discarded, but emerged as the moral center of her community, proving that dignity and intelligence could overcome any form of oppression when supported by courage and truth.